Hey, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Kaylee, and this is Read Rant Review, where, you guessed it, I read books and I do rant reviews. Today, we are going to be continuing my Casual Classics series, where I read a classic book and I give you a beat by beat, chapter by chapter breakdown in a friendly, casual way. Today, we're going to be talking about The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Currently on Goodreads, it is sitting at a 4.06 with 1.1 million ratings. It is 288 pages and it was published in January of 1963. And if you are unfamiliar, this book was published, I believe, within a month or at least the very next month. Sylvia Plath took her own life. And yes, I'm not using the actual proper word for that. Thanks, YouTube. Okay. There's a lot of censoring and self-censoring that I get criticized for in these videos. It's part of the game you have to play as a creator. I try not to do it as much as I possibly can, but there are certain words that are just like absolute red flags. So anyway, within a month of publication, that happened. And then also, if you are just unfamiliar for any reason, inherently, Sylvia Plath is incredibly famous for writing about depression and ideations and just bad mental health. So I'll give you the description of the book real quick, give you a couple disclaimers, and then we'll go ahead and dive right in. So the book description, as on Goodreads: The Bell Jar chronicles the crack-up of Esther Greenwood, brilliant, beautiful, enormously talented, and successful, but slowly going under, maybe for the last time. Sylvia Plath masterfully draws the reader into Esther's breakdown with such intensity that Esther's insanity becomes completely real and even rational, as probable and accessible an experience as going to the movies. Such deep penetration into the dark and harrowing corners of the psyche is an extraordinary accomplishment and has made The Bell Jar a haunting American classic. And then in terms of like trigger warnings, there very clearly explicit discussions about depression, mental illness, ideation, and the like continual thoughts of taking one's life is talked about throughout the entirety of the book. There's a reference to sexual assault. It doesn't happen in the book, but it gets close to happening, and there's a lot of like verbiage that happens around it that can be very triggering. And then the other thing that doesn't really get talked about in a lot of the trigger warning listings that I was able to find is there is like very blatant racism and criticism of anybody who is not a skinny white successful male and a skinny white successful female. Straight. I need to specify that as well. If you fall anywhere out of that category, there is at least some type of negative descriptor or discussion that gets used about literally everybody else that falls outside of that category. So yes, racism, homophobia, like fat phobia, everything like that. Very, very clearly laid out multiple times. So I don't know why people don't talk about it. I think there's like a level of like, oh, well, it was written in the past, it was a thing of the ages. But also, the book was published in 1963. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of the other reason why I do these classic reviews too, because it is hard to get through that stuff. It's hard to read it. The older material, when I do stuff from like the 1800s, usually my rant reviews help with those because it's incredibly difficult to read like Old English. This one, it's more of like, hey, it's incredibly depressing, and B, it's a little bit questionable, and there's not a little bit, there's some questionable content in there that is difficult to read. So it's like, hey, I went through it. Let me go ahead and give you a chance to maybe avoid the bad parts of the book and hear the good parts and hear what people enjoy about it. I hope that makes sense. Obviously, I'm not trying to minimize or dismiss or anything what was said, but there is still a story worth telling, and there's some quotes that I do think are beneficial for people to hear, and I think there's some important discussions that can come from the other parts of the book, right? So that's what we're here for today. So those disclaimers, and then the final disclaimer, this is not my forte. I'm not like trained. My education, my degrees are not in English in any way. I'm just a woman who likes to read and talk about stuff on the internet, okay? Don't make it weird. So our book opens in the summer of 1953 with 19-year-old Esther Greenwood. She is spending a month that summer in New York. She got an internship at this New York magazine, and it's her and a bunch of other girls are put up in this hotel and are assisting with it. She won, I believe it was like a writing contest or something, so she got awarded this. She grew up in the suburbs of Boston, and this is the first time that she has left that area whatsoever. Look what can happen in this country, they'd say. A girl lives in some out-of-the-way town for 19 years, so poor she can't afford a magazine. And then she gets a scholarship to college and wins a prize here and a prize there and ends up steering New York like her own private car. There are a whole bunch of girls that she's there with, but the two that really matter the most are Doreen and Betsy. And almost immediately when she's with all of these girls, she feels like an outcast. Girls like that made me sick. I'm so jealous I can't speak. 19 years and I hadn't been out of New England except for this trip to New York. It was my first big chance, but here I was sitting back and letting it run through my fingers like so much water. And all of the other girls that are there are rich and they're like bored almost with the luxuries and the lavish lifestyle that they're living in New York. And so she just feels super removed from all of it. I realized we kept piling up these presents because it was as good as free advertising for the firms involved, but I couldn't be cynical. I got such a kick out of all of those free gifts showering on us. For a long time afterward, I hid them away. But later, when I was all right again, I brought them out, and I still have them around the house. I use the lipsticks now and then, and last week I cut the plastic starfish off of the sunglasses case for the baby to play with. As stated, this book gets incredibly dark. I highlight this paragraph in chapter 1 just to make reference to. This book is written in an autobiographical way, meaning that we will be learning a lot of horrible things about Esther, but she's writing this from the future. And in this particular paragraph, when she's recalling her life and then comparing it to now, she's talking about when she got better and then also having a baby, right? Starfish off the sunglasses case for the baby to play with. We will revisit this paragraph at the very, very end of this review. I just would like to open it now and just kind of make sure that we're pointing that out very, very clearly, okay? She ends up going to a party with one of the girls. Her name is Doreen. On the way to some event, the taxi stopped at a stoplight and a couple of guys approached the car and they're like, hey, you should come party with us instead. Doreen is very adventurous, like breaking the mold, does whatever she wants to do, doesn't care what anybody thinks about it. She's just there to have a good time. Esther really, really admires this. It's something that she wants to embody until the end of this chapter, but we'll get to that in a minute. So they end up bailing on this work event. They go to this party, and Doreen meets a guy named Lenny Shepfield. He's incredibly rich. They immediately hit it off, and then he tries to set Esther up with one of his friends. She's not attracted to him in any way. He's just not her type. So they're all drinking, partying, whatever, and then Lenny wants to take Doreen back to his place. And Doreen says, well, I'm not going if Esther doesn't go. And Esther says, sure, I'll come. The guy that Lenny had tried to set her up with had wilted away into the night, so I thought I'd string along with Doreen. I wanted to see as much as I could. I liked looking at other people in crucial situations. If there was a road accident or a street fight or a baby pickled in a laboratory jar for me to look at, I'd stop and look so hard I never forgot. I certainly learned a lot of things I never would have learned otherwise this way. And even when they surprised me or made me sick, I never let on, but pretended that's the way I knew things were all the time. In chapter 2, they're at Lenny's house, and Esther is just watching the two of them while they're dancing, while they're flirting, and eventually what they're doing starts to escalate into something a lot more frisky. And so Esther decides to just like escort herself out and go back to the hotel. And when she gets there, she opens up the window. Again, they're like high-rise hotel in the middle of New York, opens up the window, kind of places her head against it, and says, the silence depressed me. It wasn't the silence of silence. It was my own silence. I knew perfectly well the cars were making a noise, and the people in them and behind the lit windows of the buildings were making a noise, and the river was making a noise, but I couldn't hear a thing. The city hung in my window, flat as a poster, glittering and blinking, but it might as well just have not been there at all, for the good that it did me. And so she decides to take a hot bath. And I'm going to be reading so many quotes out of this book because it genuinely, obviously a biased opinion because Sylvia Plath is one of my favorite writers. She has such a way with words and describing certain, I don't know, just feelings that I don't feel I could even begin to summarize. And so I'd much rather just read you out these portions and then kind of talk about it between the pieces, okay? After this party, this feeling kind of gross and icky, she wants to take a hot bath. There must be quite a few things that a hot bath won't cure, but I don't know many of them. Whenever I'm sad I'm going to die, or so nervous I can't sleep, or in love with somebody I won't be seeing for a week, I slump down just so far, and then I say, I'll go take a hot bath. I meditate in the bath. The water needs to be very hot, so hot you can barely stand putting your foot in it. Then you lower yourself, inch by inch, till the water's up to your neck. I remember the ceiling over every bathtub I've stretched out in. I remember the texture of the ceilings and the cracks and the colors and the damp spots of the light fixtures. I remember the tubs too, the antique griffin-legged tubs and the modern coffin-shaped tubs, and the fancy pink marble tubs overlooking indoor lily ponds. And I remember the shapes and sizes of the water taps and the different sorts of soap holders. I never feel so much myself as when I'm in a hot bath. I lay in that tub on the 17th floor of this hotel for women only, high up over the jazz and push of New York, for near onto an hour, and I felt myself growing pure again. I don't believe in baptism or the waters of Jordan or anything like that, but I guess I feel about a hot bath the way those religious people feel about holy water. I said to myself, Doreen is dissolving, Lenny is dissolving, Frankie is dissolving, New York is dissolving. They are all dissolving away and none of them matter anymore. I don't know them, I have never known them, and I am very pure. All that liquor and those sticky kisses I saw and the dirt that settled on my skin on the way back is turning into something pure. The longer I lay there in the clear, hot water, the purer I felt. And when I stepped out at last and wrapped myself in one of the big, soft, white hotel bath towels, I felt pure and sweet as a new baby. This also is something that gets continually revisited throughout this book, this idea of like rebirth and purity and becoming again. It'll make more sense later. So she gets out of the tub. Everything's cool. She's feeling happy. She tries to go to sleep. She wakes up a couple hours later to Doreen banging on her door. And then one of the like hotel people that like escorted her up, because the woman is like drunk off her butt and can barely walk, right? They're like banging on Esther's door. She opens it and decides to leave Doreen in the hallway. I made a decision about her that night. I decided I would watch her and listen to what she said, but deep down, I would have nothing to do with her. Deep down, I would be loyal to Betsy and her innocent friends. It was Betsy I resembled at heart. So Betsy is one of the other girls there who is more of like this pure, I think she kind of thinks that she's dumb and doesn't really have too much ambition. And so she wanted to be more like this like adventurous, do your own thing Doreen, but in her heart, she's kind of this Betsy. And it's this like, throughout the book, there's the idea of like the Madonna whore complex, which if you don't know what that is, I'll just read you the Wikipedia entry. In Psycho, and is this true? I don't know. Again, I don't know anything. This is just what it reminded me of, so I'm telling you. Don't listen to anything I say. Take it all with a grain of salt. In psychoanalysis, a Madonna whore complex is the inability to maintain sexual arousal within a committed and loving relationship. First identified by Sigmund Freud, who called it psychic impotence. It is a psychological complex that is said to develop in men who see women as either the saintly Madonnas or debased whores. Men with this complex desire a sexual partner who has been degraded, while they cannot desire the respected partner. Freud wrote, "Where such men love, they have no desire, and where they desire, they cannot love." So this book, and a lot of the people that kind of get referenced in these like, almost like kind of symbolism of people, are directly tied to the idea of this complex. And not even just necessarily in terms of like men feeling that way, but just internalized how Esther looks at women and how she looks at the world and how the world looks at her, right? It's that whole idea of like purity and whatnot, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more. In chapter 3, she goes to a banquet and we learn a lot about her past, mostly just being that she is not educated in a lot of these like really fancy pants events and whatnot. And it was kind of a struggle to learn a lot of it. And it was a really, really steep learning curve to come from where she came from to where she is now. And it's kind of this like night and day difference of lifestyles. So she's thinking about this. She's thinking about her past, and she is supposed to be getting prepared to go to yet another banquet for work. She skips it. She says, okay, well, maybe I'll go to the Furs show where the other half of the girls are going. She ends up skipping that as well. I felt very low. I had been unmasked only that morning by JC herself, and I felt now that all the uncomfortable suspicions I had about myself were coming true, and I couldn't hide the truth much longer. After 19 years of running after good marks and prizes and grants of one sort and another, I was letting up, slowing down, dropping clean out of the race. So the way the story is told is like, it's reflective in a way of like trying to tell like a linear storyline, and then it kind of juts off into like the random memories that come up as she's going through her days. So it is a little bit confusing in terms of storytelling. Like if you're reading through the novel, there's no clear indicator of when we're talking about something happening right now versus something she's remembering from 6 months ago, earlier that morning, a week ago. Like, it's just kind of this like flow of consciousness, discussion, and memory about events that are happening. So it is kind of funky in that way. And so when Betsy comes back after the first show, right after everything, she's like, oh, I thought you were going to go. What happened? Like, where were you at? I told Betsy how I had been lying in bed that morning, planning to go to the first show. What I did not tell her was that Doreen had come into my room earlier and said, what do you want to go to that assy show for? Lenny and I are going to Coney Island, so why don't you come along? Lenny can get you a nice fellow. The day's shot to hell anyhow with the luncheon, and then film premiere in the afternoon, so nobody'll miss us. For a minute, I was tempted. The show certainly did seem stupid. I have never cared for furs. What I decided to do in the end was lie in bed as long as I wanted to, and then go to Central Park and spend the day lying in the grass, the longest grass I could find in that bald, duck-ponded wilderness. I told Doreen I would not go to the show or the luncheon or the film premiere, but that I would not go to Coney Island either. I would stay in bed. After Doreen left, I wondered why I couldn't go the whole way doing what I should anymore. This made me sad and tired. Then I wondered why I couldn't go the whole way doing what I shouldn't, the way Doreen did, and this made me even sadder and even more tired. Ultimately, what she ends up telling Betsy is that JC called her into work, which is true, but JC called her into work because she wasn't at any of the events, right? So she gets up there. JC is her boss, by the way, of the newspaper. Calls her into her office, and she says, doesn't your work interest you, Esther? Oh, it does. It does, I said. It interests me very much. I felt like yelling the words as if that might make them more convincing, but I controlled myself. All my life, I told myself studying and reading and writing and working like mad was what I wanted to do. And it actually seemed to be true. I did everything well enough and got all A's, and by the time I made it to college, nobody could stop me. I was college correspondent for the Town Gazette, and editor of the literary magazine, and secretary of Honor Board, which deals with academic and social offenses and punishments, a popular office. And I had a well-known woman poet and professor on the faculty championing me for graduate school at the biggest universities in the East, and promises of full scholarships all the way. And now I was apprenticed to the best editor on an intellectual fashion magazine. And what did I do but balk and balk like a dull cart horse? I'm very interested in everything. The words fell with a hollow flatness on JC's desk, like so many wooden nickels. JC kind of moves along the conversation, and she says, okay, well, what do you have in mind after you graduate? She's thinking this. What I always thought I had in mind was getting some big scholarship to graduate school or a grant to study all over Europe. And then I thought I'd be a professor and write books of poems, or write books of poems and be an editor of some sort. Usually I had these plans on the tip of my tongue. I don't really know, I heard myself say. I felt a deep shock hearing myself say that, because the minute I said it, I knew it was true. It sounded true, and I recognized it, the way you recognize some nondescript person that's been hanging around your door for ages, and then suddenly comes up and introduces himself as your real father and looks exactly like you, so you know he really is your father. And then the person you thought all your life was your father is a sham. She eventually tells JC that maybe she would like to get into publishing. JC gives her some advice about taking some foreign languages to like be more competitive for grad schools and for jobs. In chapter 4, Esther goes to a banquet with all of the girls, and then they go to a movie afterward. At the banquet, all of the girls eat crab meat that is like undercooked, so they all get food poisoning. It's really, really horrific. It takes them all like a couple of days to get healed. Literally just like, if you've had food poisoning, you understand. And so at the end of it, she's thinking, I felt purged and holy and ready for a new life. And the people who hosted the banquet, in order to get the girls to not sue them or have like bad publicity or anything, sent them a bunch of like presents, which happened to be books of like the 30 most famous short stories, to kind of help them get through their illness or whatever, and just kind of, you know what I mean, just kind of buy them off basically. But Esther, when she finds out about this, I began to feel if it was a good enough present, I wouldn't mind about what happened because I felt so pure as a result. Once she's all healed up from this food poisoning, she wakes up really early one day to a phone call from a guy named Constantine. He is an interpreter at the United Nations and is a friend of Esther's kind of boyfriend's mom, which sounds a little bit confusing, I know, but just bear with us here, okay? That's who Constantine got her number from, and he says, hey, do you want to go to lunch? Really, it's to buy this idea of like this whole IOU thing. I believe he's from Russia. I detected the vocabulary of Mrs. Willard and my heart sank. Mrs. Willard always invited you for a bite to eat. I remembered that this man had been a guest at Mrs. Willard's house when he first came to America. Mrs. Willard had one of those arrangements where you open your house to foreigners, and then when you go abroad, they open their houses to you. I now saw quite clearly that Mrs. Willard had simply traded her open house in Russia for my bite to eat in New York, right? So it's all just like a networking game and like a connections game. So she's going to end up going and getting lunch with this guy named Constantine. She's comparing him in her head. She hasn't met the guy yet, but like while she's getting ready to go and get lunch with him, she's thinking about Buddy, right? Mrs. Willard's son, her boyfriend thing. She had been kind of infatuated with him. I adored him from a distance for 5 years before he even looked at me. And then there was a beautiful time when I still adored him and he started looking at me. And then just as he was looking at me more and more, I discovered quite by accident what an awful hypocrite he was. And now he wanted me to marry him and I hated his guts. The worst part of it was I couldn't come straight out and tell him what I thought of him because he had caught tuberculosis before I could do that. And now I had to humor him along until he got well again and could take the unvarnished truth. She ends up reading one of the short stories from the gift present book thing from the Bakewit people. And in it, it's talking about a fig tree. We'll revisit the fig analogy later. This one doesn't really matter so much. But what it does allude to, or what it does lead to for us, is her reflecting on talking to Buddy about her love for poetry and how Buddy had told her, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I said. "A piece of dust." And he looked so proud for having thought of this. These conversations I had in my mind usually repeated the beginnings of conversations I'd really had with Buddy, only they finished with me answering him back quite sharply instead of just sitting around and saying, "I guess so." Now, lying on my back in bed, I imagined Buddy saying, "Do you know what a poem is, Esther?" "No, what?" I would say. "A piece of dust." Then, just as he was smiling and starting to look proud, I would say, "So are the cadavers you cut up. So are the people you're cutting. They're dust as dust as dust. I reckon a good poem lasts a whole lot longer than 100 of those people put together." And of course, Buddy wouldn't have any answer to that because what I said was true. People were made of nothing so much as dust, and I couldn't see that doctoring all that dust was a bit better than writing poems people would remember and repeat to themselves when they were unhappy or sick or couldn't sleep. This leads to some more reflection about her relationship with Buddy and the introduction of a character named Joan. So Buddy had come to visit her, like I said, so he's a little bit older. He had no interest in her for quite a few years. He went off to go to college. One of the times he came back, he randomly visits her and sits outside, and she's super excited because she's had a crush on him forever. Their moms are best friends. They're talking back and forth, and she thinks that he's about to ask her out or ask to go on a date or something. And instead he says, "Yeah, sorry, I can only stay for a minute. I'm about to go to the prom with Joan." So she shuts down, right? She's like, "Oh, cool, you suck." She's like, "Well, don't worry. I'm about to go on a double date anyway. Like, I have to go and get ready and go and meet with these boys." Buddy hands her the little blue envelope, and he says, "I was going to give this to you, but never mind. Here's a letter I meant to leave for you if you weren't in. There's a question in it you can answer by mail. I don't feel like asking you about it right now." After Buddy had gone, I opened the letter. It was a letter inviting me to the Yale junior prom. So he's going to the Yale sophomore prom right now with the other woman. Buddy's just a playa, and he's now going to go to junior prom with her, right? She doesn't really care about him. Like, almost immediately, we're introduced to this idea of Esther just kind of going along with what she thinks people want of her or what she thinks is expected of her, but not actually being a willing participant, or at least like not all mentally wanting to do what is you know what I'm saying? She's just kind of like flowing through life and not like actively living her life. Cut to future time, right? They're going to the prom, and then afterward he goes to kiss her. I stood pretending to admire this like tree line. He had like taken her up to the back of this chemistry lab for some beautiful view of the campus. And I stood pretending to admire them while Buddy got a good footing on the rough soil. While he kissed me, I kept my eyes open and tried to memorize the spacing of the house lights so I would never forget them. When Buddy pulls back and he's like, wow, that was the best kiss ever. That was so amazing. Like, you must really, like, be talented. Like, you must get around, is kind of his insinuation. She's like, yeah, I guess I do go out with a lot of boys. Buddy kissed me again in front of the house steps. And the next fall, when his scholarship to medical school came through, I went there to see him instead of to Yale. And it was there that I found out how he had fooled me all those years and what a hypocrite he was. I found out on the day we saw the baby born. So in chapter 6, I kept begging Buddy to show me some really interesting hospital sites. So one Friday, I cut all my classes and came down for a long weekend, and he gave me the works. He's in medical school now. He like sneaks her into the hospital, just kind of like throws some scrubs on her, and she just walks around pretending to be a student, like a student doctor thing with him, which is so crazy, the stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s that you could just do that. So he's like taking her to all of these crazy sites. It's a lot of, there's actually like some crazy gruesome stuff that gets described here. And they end up going and seeing a woman giving birth. And one of the other guys that's there, who is, it's not interning, but he has to deliver a couple babies before he can get like approved to be an actual doctor. He has to do like have the real world practice stuff. Resident? I don't know. He tells her, you oughtn't to see this. You'll never want to have a baby if you do. They oughtn't to let women watch. It'll be the end of the human race. So she witnesses this. Horrific, very detailed descriptions of a woman giving birth. Later, Buddy told me that the woman was on a drug that would make her forget that she had had any pain. And when she swore and groaned, she really didn't know what she was doing because she was in a kind of twilight sleep. I thought it sounded just like the sort of drug that a man would invent. Here was a woman in terrible pain, obviously feeling every bit of it, or she wouldn't groan like that. And she would go straight home and start another baby because the drug would make her forget how bad the pain had been. When all the time, in some secret part of her, that long, blind, doorless, and windowless corridor of pain was waiting to open up and shut her in again. Good God. So they go back to his dorm room, they're chatting, kind of BSing, having a good time, whatever. And eventually he says, hey, have you ever seen a man? She says, no. And he says, well, do you want to see me? I didn't know what to say. My mother and my grandmother had started hinting around to me a lot lately about what a fine, clean boy Buddy Willard was. Coming from such a fine, clean family, and how everybody at church thought he was a model person, so kind to his parents and to older people, as well as so athletic and so handsome and so intelligent. All I'd heard about really was how fine and clean Buddy was, and how he was the kind of person a girl should stay fine and clean for. So I didn't really see the harm in anything that Buddy would think up to do. So she says, okay. He pulls his stuff out. She doesn't have any type of reaction, and it's kind of awkward. He says, okay, well, now let me see you. She says, no. He puts everything away. And then she says, hey, have you ever had an affair? He turns pink instead of answering. She's like, I don't know why I asked. It never even crossed my mind before that he would have done anything with anybody, but I just had this urge to ask. She does. He doesn't answer. She's like, oh my God. She asks again, and he says, I have. Tell me about it. Who was it? But he seemed relieved that I wasn't angry. He even seemed relieved to have somebody to tell about it, about how he was seduced. At first, I thought he must have just slept with the waitress only once, but then when I asked how many times, just to make sure, he said he couldn't remember, but a couple of times a week for the rest of summer. I multiplied 3 by 10 and got 30, which seemed beyond all reason. After that, something in me just froze up. Back at college, I started asking a senior here and a senior there what they would do if a boy they knew suddenly told them that he'd slept 30 times with some slutty waitress one summer, smack in the middle of knowing them. But these seniors said most boys were like that, and you couldn't honestly accuse them of anything until you were at least pinned or engaged to be married. Actually, it wasn't the idea of Buddy sleeping with somebody that bothered me. I mean, I'd read about all sorts of people sleeping with each other, and if it had been any other boy, I would merely have asked him the most interesting details, and maybe gone out and slept with somebody myself just to even things up. But then thought no more about it. What I couldn't stand was Buddy's pretending I was so sexy and he was so pure, when all the time he had been having an affair with that tardy waitress and must have felt like laughing in my face. Okay, so again, you kind of see some of the phrasing that I'm talking about here a little bit too, of like, you understand. I don't need to tell you what's wrong with passages that I read. I hope we're all on the same page and understanding that, like, right, there's issues with certain things, right? I don't need to sit here and like dissect every single one of them. Blanket understanding. But just to acknowledge that the whole idea of purity and how deeply ingrained into her that this is, like how much of an important role that it has in the concept of this book and like her vision of herself. And so the chapter ends with her, after she hears this story of him, she wants to break up with him. And when she's about to, he ends up calling her. She knows that it's serious because it costs a lot of money to call people, and tells her that he has TB, tuberculosis. So now she can't break up with him. But also that's kind of convenient because now she doesn't have to tell everybody, and it won't be this whole dramatic thing, and she'll have to go on blind dates again and whatnot. So instead, I simply told everybody that Buddy had TB and we were practically engaged. And when I stayed in to study on Saturday nights, they were extremely kind to me because they thought I was so brave, working the way I did just to hide a broken heart. In chapter 7, she's finally actually going on the date with Constantine. Like I said, so the past like chapter and a half have all been recalls, right? It has all been like recollections of previous summers. We're back into current day. Well, kind of, because even this is still like a past autobiographical recollection of things. You understand what I'm saying, that we're back into like the main timeline of events. So she's about to go on this date with Constantine. He picks her up. They're driving, and they're driving with the top down. He has a convertible. He took my hand and squeezed it, and I felt happier than I had been since I was about 9 and running along the hot white beaches with my father in the summer before he died. And while Constantine and I sat in one of the 100-plush auditoriums in the UN, United Nations, next to a stern, muscular Russian girl with no makeup who was a simultaneous interpreter like Constantine, I thought how strange it had never occurred to me before that I was only purely happy until I was 9 years old. After that, in spite of the Girl Scouts and the piano lessons, and the watercolor lessons, and the dancing lessons, and the sailing camp, all of which my mother scrimped to give to me, and college, with crewing in the mist before breakfast, and black bottom pies, and the little new firecrackers of ideas going off every day, I had never been really happy again. So when she's with all of these people, all of these interpreters, she is starting to feel incredibly inadequate. She's realizing how incredibly talented all of these people are, and she starts adding up all of the things that I could not do. One of the things she could not do was she didn't know shorthand. This meant I couldn't get a good job after college. My mother kept telling me nobody wanted a plain English major, but an English major who knew shorthand was something else again. Everybody would want her. She would be in demand among all the up-and-coming young men, and she would transcribe letter after thrilling letter. The trouble was, I hated the idea of serving men in any way. I wanted to dictate my own thrilling letters. My list grew longer. I was a terrible dancer. I couldn't carry a tune. I had no sense of balance. And when we had to walk down a narrow board with our hands out and a book on our heads in gym class, I always fell over. I couldn't ride a horse or ski, the two things I wanted to do most because they cost too much money. I couldn't speak German or read Hebrew or write Chinese. I didn't even know where most of the old and out-of-the-way countries the UN men in front of me represented fitted in on a map. For the first time in my life, sitting here in the soundproof heart of the UN building between Constantine, who could play tennis as well as simultaneously interpret, and the Russian girl who knew so many idioms, I felt dreadfully inadequate. The trouble was, I had been inadequate all along. I simply hadn't thought about it. The one thing I was good at was winning scholarships and prizes, and that era was coming to an end. I felt like a racehorse in a world without racetracks, where a champion college football player suddenly confronted by Wall Street in a business suit. His days of glory shrunk to a little gold cup on his mantle with a date engraved on it like the date on a tombstone. I saw my life branching out before me, like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and the other fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another was Constantine and his friends and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind about which figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest, and as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one, they plopped to the ground at my feet. Oh my God. So that's probably one of the most famous excerpts from this entire book, I would say. If not, probably one of the more frequently cited, pieces of writing from Sylvia Plath just in general. Oh my God. Oh. The other reason too, so pretty much anything I'm reading out loud to, I just deeply related to in a way that is again, so crazy. I know I said it before with the 1820s, books that I was reading, like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and whatnot, applicable here as well in the 1960s, 1950s. Just like craziness, dude. The freaking human experience is just like standing the test of time and whatnot. It's just, it'll never not amaze me. And so she goes on the rest of the night with all of the UN people partying, having a good time. And I felt so fine by the time that we came to our last course. I decided that I would let Constantine seduce me. Ever since Buddy Willard had told me about the waitress, I had been thinking I ought to go out and sleep with somebody myself. Sleeping with Buddy wouldn't count, though, because he would still be one person ahead of me and it had to be with somebody else. She had talked to one guy previously about, having sex. He had said it was nothing like it was cracked up to be. It was as boring as going to the toilet. I said maybe if you loved a woman, it wouldn't seem so boring. But he said that it would be spoiled by thinking this woman, too, was just an animal like the rest. So if he loved anybody, he would never go to bed with her. He would go to a whore if he had to and keep the woman he loved free of all that dirty business. It had crossed my mind at the time that Eric might be a good person to go to bed with, since he had already done it, and unlike the usual run of boys, didn't seem dirty-minded or silly when he talked about it. But then Eric wrote me a letter saying he thought he might really be able to love me. I was so intelligent and cynical and yet had such a kind face. Surprisingly like his older sisters. Ew. So I knew it was no use. I was the type he would never go to bed with, and I wrote him I was unfortunately about to marry a childhood sweetheart. It goes on to talk about, too, of like, speaking of thinking of sleeping with people, she's like, the older I got, the more and more my mom and my grandma would try to talk to me about things, and my mother had sent a cutout of a Reader's Digest and mailed it to me when I was at college. The article was written by a married woman lawyer with children called In Defense of Chastity. It gave all the reasons a girl shouldn't sleep with anybody but her husband, and even then only after they were married. The main point of the article was that a man's world is different from a woman's world, and a man's emotions are different from a woman's emotions, and only marriage can bring the two worlds and the two different sets of emotions together properly. My mother said that this was something a girl didn't know about until it was too late, so she had to take the advice of people who were already experts, like a married woman. The woman lawyer said the best men wanted to be pure for their wives, and even if they weren't pure, they wanted to be the ones to teach their wives about sex. Of course, they would try to persuade a girl to have sex and say they would marry her later, but as soon as she gave in, they would lose all respect for her and start saying that if she did that with them, she would do that with other men, and they would end up by making her life miserable. The woman finished her article by saying better safe than sorry, and besides, there was no sure way of not getting stuck with a baby, and then you'd really be in a pickle. Now, the one thing this article didn't seem to me to consider was how a girl felt. It might be nice to be pure and then marry a pure man, but what if he suddenly confessed he wasn't pure after we were married the way that Buddy Willard had? I couldn't stand the idea of a woman having to have a single pure life and a man being able to have a double life, one pure and one not. Finally, I decided that if it was too difficult to find a red-blooded, intelligent man who was still pure by the time he was 21, I might as well forget about staying pure myself and marry somebody who wasn't pure either. Then, when he started to make my life miserable, I could make his life miserable as well. When I was 19, though, pureness was the great issue. Instead of the world being divided up into Catholics and Protestants or Republicans and Democrats or white men and black men or even men and women, I saw the world divided into people who had slept with somebody and people who hadn't. And this seemed the only really significant difference between one person and another. I thought a spectacular change would come over me the day that I crossed that boundary line. Jeez Louise, dude, right? So, like, just, even 60 years later, I don't know, man. That's just crazy. I feel like we're still having these same conversations about purity and whatnot. I feel like this is all still, like, stuff that's happening. Not so much in, like, mainstream. I guess this is also, like, coming from, like, I grew up Protestant upbringing and semi, like, evangelical type belief system where I had a lot of these exact same thoughts when I was this age and kind of going through all of these things where it was like, oh my God. It's just so weird seeing it written out in such a way. I don't know, obviously I was 19 10 years ago, so who knows how much things have even changed since then in terms of what kids are thinking these days, young adults are thinking these days. And also, purity is not the correct word. I know, again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just using the terminology used in the book for sake of consistency here. I'm not saying I agree with it in any way. So anyway, she ends up going with Constantine. They smoke. She goes back to his apartment. They're smoking on the patio for a while. They end up going inside. She lays down on his bed, hoping to maybe he'll make a move on her or something. But instead, he just lays down next to her and is still fully clothed. Like, all they did was take their shoes off. And she's laying on her stomach. He's laying on his back, just like staring at the ceiling. I looked at him secretly from under the fall of my hair. He was lying on his back, his hands under his head, staring at the ceiling. The starched white sleeves of his shirt rolled up to the elbows, glimmered eerily in the half-dark, and his tan skin seemed almost black. I thought he must be the most beautiful man that I had ever seen. I thought if only I had a keen, shapely bone structure to my face, or could discuss politics shrewdly, or was a famous writer, Constantine might find me interesting enough to sleep with. And then I wondered if as soon as he came to like me, he would sink into ordinariness, and if as soon as he came to love me, I would find fault after fault, the way I did with Buddy Willard and the boys before him. The same thing happened over and over. I would catch sight of some flawless man off in the distance. I immediately saw he wouldn't do at all. That's one of the reasons I never wanted to get married. The last thing I wanted was infinite security and to be the place of an arrow shoots off from. I wanted change and excitement and to shoot off in all directions myself, like the colored arrows from a 4th of July rocket. They end up falling asleep together in the dark. She wakes up. It's 3 a.m. and she is trying to imagine what it would be like if Constantine were my husband. Like, if she were to wake up next to him as usual, if this was like the domesticity, you know the word I'm trying to use, the domestic life that is an option, right, on the fig tree. She's thinking about it. It would mean getting up at 7 and cooking him eggs and bacon and toast and coffee and dawdling about in my nightgown and curlers after he'd left for work to wash up the dirty plates and make the bed. And then when he came home after a lively, fascinating day, he'd expect a big dinner, and I'd spend the evening washing up even more dirty plates till I fell into the bed utterly exhausted. This seemed a dreary and wasteful life for a girl with 15 years of straight A's. But I knew that that's what marriage was like, because cook and clean and wash was just what Buddy Willard's mother did from morning till night. And she was the wife of a university professor and had been a private school teacher herself. Once when I visited Buddy, I had found Mrs. Willard... Oh, this story makes me so sad. Once I had visited Buddy, I found Mrs. Willard braiding a rug out of strips of wool from Mr. Willard's old suits. She'd spent weeks on that rug, and I had admired the tweedy browns and greens and blues patterning the braid. But after Mrs. Willard was through, instead of hanging the rug on the wall the way that I would have done, she put it down in place of her kitchen mat. And in a few days, it was soiled and dull and indistinguishable from any mat that you could buy for under $1. And I knew that in spite of all of those roses and kisses and restaurant dinners, a man showered on a woman before he married her. What he secretly wanted when the wedding service ended was for her to flatten out underneath his feet like Mrs. Willard's kitchen mat. Hadn't my own mother told me that as soon as she and my father left Reno on their honeymoon, my father had been married before, so he needed a divorce. My father said to her, "Phew, what a relief. Now we can stop pretending and be ourselves, huh?" And from that day on, my mother never had a minute's peace. I also remembered Buddy Willard saying in a sinister, knowing way that after I had children, I would feel differently. I wouldn't want to write poems anymore. So I began to think maybe it was true, that when you married and you had children, it was like being brainwashed. And afterward, you went about numb as a slave in some private totalitarian state. Oh my God. I'm not gonna lie. That's what terrified me so much growing up about like getting married and having kids and any of that stuff. Yeah, I didn't get married until I was 28 years old. Pretty much for that exact reason. Because I was just so scared. You get so scared that you end up like marrying the wrong person and you end up in a situation like that. People are so scary. Life is so scary. Especially to be 19 again and thinking about all of that. Oh, I just feel so deeply. That's all I can say. I honestly, this is the other reason too that I want to talk about this. And there's some other references and commentary I'll make as we go through it. I am glad that I read this book when I am in a good place in life where I feel like I made it to the other side. Because if I would have read this when I was 19, 23... 21, like that kind of age range. Any younger than that, I think I would have been like a lot worse for wear, and that's why I put off reading that. Like I just read this book like today and yesterday. I did not read this book for a very, very long time because I knew how depressing it was. Like people had made it very, very clear to me of like, hey, don't read this if like you're not doing well and you know, whatever type of way. Like this is not a healthy mental health book at all. And I can see why. And now that I'm on this like other side of the world in these like types of thoughts, and I'm like, wow, I made it. It's kind of not interesting, kind of crazy. It's almost affirming, but also like really horrifically bad. I'm not finishing any of my sentences, I know, But to read something that I relate to so heavily, knowing that it can get better and it does get better and things can and will work out is almost affirming to go through and see how other people feel about things, and that maybe I wasn't alone in all of these thought processes and the way that I would deal with things and cope with different issues. It is validating to read it from this point in my life. Had I had read this before I made it to the other side, and knowing that Sylvia Plath took her own life after this book was published, I don't know if I would have had the same reaction or been thankful for the read or anything like that. I think it would have been like confirmation of all of the bad things, right? Like it would have had the total opposite effect on me. So like, I'm actually really glad I put this off until just now. And so I also say this to take a break almost halfway through the book to say, hey, if you are not on the other side of these negative thoughts and the things that we're about to get to, it does get better as much as it doesn't feel like it. And the chapter ends with it's raining outside and he's taken her home, and every time it rained, the old leg break seemed to remember itself, and what it remembered was a dull hurt. And then I thought, Buddy Willard made me break that leg. Then I thought, no, I broke it myself. I broke it on purpose to pay myself back for being such a heel. And so we go back in chapter 8, and she's reflecting on how she broke her leg. It was the day after Christmas, and a gray sky bellied over us fat with snow. I felt overstuffed and dull and disappointed the way I always do after Christmas, as if whatever it was, the pine boughs and the candles and the silver and gilt-ribboned presents and the birch log fires and the Christmas turkey and the carols at the top of the piano promised never came to pass. She is going up with the Willards, right, the mom and the dad. They're driving with her up to the Adirondacks to go and visit Buddy. That's where he's staying for his like TB sanatorium treatment stuff. This is the first time that she has seen him in forever. And the dad, Mr. Willard, pretty much like takes her up there, drops her off with Buddy, and leaves. I felt that Mr. Willard had deserted me. I thought he must have planned it all along, but Buddy said no. His father simply couldn't stand the sight of sickness, especially his own son's sickness, because he thought all sickness was sickness of the will. Mr. Willard had never been sick a day in his life. I bring up that quote specifically because that also is kind of a through line of this book of a lot of people, right? We have the purity aspect, the whole like Madonna horror complex aspect, like those two things kind of correlate. And then we have this idea of sickness being a choice, both physical and mental health and sickness being a choice. And all of the characters kind of having this like blanket belief that that's what it is. They have a little bit of conversation back and forth. Now keep in mind, this is after she knows about him sleeping with the waitress. They haven't really been talking very much kind of since that and since everything. Just kind of been maintaining the peace because she didn't want to break up with him while he was ill, but they really haven't had much like bonding or anything otherwise. But while she's there, they're sitting together and he says, "How would you like to be Mrs. Buddy Willard?" I had an awful impulse to laugh. I thought of how that question would have bowled me over in my 5 or 6 year period of adoring Buddy Willard from a distance. Buddy saw me hesitate. "Oh, I'm in no shape now, I know," he said quickly. "I'm still on treatment and I may yet lose a rib or two, but I'll be back at med school by next fall and a year from this spring at the latest. I think I should tell you something, Buddy." "I know," Buddy said stiffly. "You met someone." "No, it's not that." "What is it then?" "I'm never gonna get married." "You're crazy." Buddy brightened. "You'll change your mind." "No, my mind's made up." But Buddy just went on looking cheerful. "Remember," I said, "that time that you hitchhiked back to college with me after skit night?" "I remember." "Remember how you asked me where I liked to live the best, the country or the city?" "And you said," "And I said I wanted to live in the country and in the city both." Buddy nodded. "And you," I continued with a sudden force, "laughed and said I had the perfect setup for a true neurotic, and that question came from some questionnaire that you'd had in psychology class that week." Buddy's smile dimmed. "Well, you were right. I am neurotic. I could never settle down in either the country or the city." "You could live between them," Buddy suggested helpfully. "Then you could go to the city sometimes and the country sometimes." What's so neurotic about that?" Buddy didn't answer. "Well," I rapped out, thinking, "you can't coddle these sick people. It's the worst thing for them. It'll spoil them to bits." "Nothing," Buddy said in a pale, still voice. "If neurotic is wanting two mutually exclusive things at one and the same time, then I'm neurotic as hell. I'll be flying back and forth between one mutually exclusive thing and another for the rest of my days." Buddy put his hand on mine. let me fly with you. I don't like Buddy, but I like that sentiment. And I especially don't like Buddy because the very next day, he takes her skiing. She has never skied before, and neither had he, but he said that the elementary principles were quite simple, and as he had often watched the ski instructors and their pupils, he could teach me all that I needed to know. Then he takes her to the top of the mountain and says, there you go. Good luck. Buddy accompanied me to the rope tow and showed me how to let my rope run through my hands, and then told me to close my fingers around it and go up. It never occurred to me to say no. And so she's at the top of the mountain and she's looking down the ski slope and she's seeing all the people jetting by, and she knows, like, she doesn't know how to stop. She doesn't know how to zigzag, which is to, I believe, like, slow yourself down, right? I don't know. I've never skied before, but it's kind of an important piece of it, I believe. She doesn't know how to do that. He's like, you're fine. Just go straight down. You'll be good. No stress. You got this. So she gets up there. She's looking down. And the thought that I might kill myself formed in my mind coolly as a tree or a flower. And I aimed straight down. A keen wind that had been hiding itself struck me full in the mouth and raked my hair back horizontal in my head. I was descending, but the white sun rose no higher. It hung over suspended waves of the hills, an insentient pivot without which the world would not exist. A small answering point in my own body flew toward it. I felt my lungs inflate with the inrush of scenery, air, mountains, trees, people, and I thought, this is what it is to be happy. She ends up crashing, and everybody is crowding around her. Buddy is like floating over her head, and she says, I'm going up. I'm going to do it again, because the adrenaline and the rush of it and the kind of walking that line of dying, she was happy, right? So she's like, I'm going to go and do it again. He says, no, you're not. A queer, satisfied expression came over Buddy's face. No, you're not. He repeated with a final smile. Your leg's broken in 2 places. You'll be stuck in a cast for months. Oh my God. Oh, that hurts me so bad. Oh, that just sucks. She goes in chapter 9. We're back to the fashion, the month at the fashion magazine in New York, right? We're continuing. It's pretty much the last day there, and they're getting pictures taken. I didn't want my picture taken because I was going to cry. I didn't know why I was going to cry, but I knew that if anybody spoke to me or looked at me too closely, the tears would fly out of my eyes and the sobs would fly out of my throat, and I would cry for a week. I could feel the tears brimming and sloshing in me like water in a glass that is unsteady and too full. This was the last round of photographs before the magazine went to press, and we returned to Tulsa or Biloxi or Teaneck or Coos Bay or wherever we had come from, and we were supposed to be photographed with props to show what we wanted to be. When they asked me what I wanted to be, I said I didn't know. Oh, sure you know, the photographer said. She said JC wittily, to be everything. I said I wanted to be a poet. I don't know why that makes me want to cry. And so they give her a rose or something, and they tell her to think about what it would be like to be a poet. And she starts just sobbing uncontrollably. And JC leaves the room. The photographer leaves the room. Eventually JC comes back with a stack of manuscripts and stuff for Esther to edit to make her feel better. And she's going through and editing these, and she was imagining she had written one of these, imagining her name was typed in the upper right-hand corner. After my month on the magazine, I'd applied for a summer school course with a famous writer where you sent the manuscript of the story, and he read it and said whether you were good enough to be admitted into his class. I had sent in my story a long time ago and hadn't heard from the writer yet, but I was sure I'd find the letter of acceptance waiting for me on the table at home. I decided I would surprise JC and send in a couple of the stories I wrote in this class under a pseudonym. Then one day, the fiction editor would come in to see JC personally and plop the stories down on her desk and say, here's something a cut above the usual. And JC would agree and accept them and ask the author to lunch. And it would be me. Oh. So then they go to a party. She goes to a party with Doreen and Doreen's boyfriend guy, Lenny, to kind of celebrate their the last hoorah in New York. One of Lenny's friends is a guy named Marco. He's wearing a diamond on a pin. He gives it to her, and he says, I shall perform some small service worthy of a diamond, and grabs her arm hard enough to cause bruises. And then she says, I had never met a woman hater before. I could tell Marco was a woman hater because in spite of all the models and TV starlets in the room that night, he paid attention to nobody but me. Not out of kindness or even curiosity, but because I'd happened to be dealt to him, like a playing card in a pack of identical cards. And it's very threatening and not a great time. And so she clocks that he's in love with somebody else, and he's just like taking his anger out on her. And so she asks who he's in love with. He says his first cousin, and it's like so weird to me. She says, "Why don't you marry her?" Impossible. Why? Marco shrugged. "She's my first cousin. She's going to be a nun." "Is she beautiful?" "There's no one to touch her." "Does she know you love her?" "Of course." I paused. The obstacle seemed unreal to me. "If you love her, you'll love somebody else someday." What the hell? I don't understand that response. I don't understand any of that conversation. And then it goes on to him trying to assault her in this garden. There's a lot of words and stuff that are very, like, a lot. She ends up punching him in the nose, making his nose bleed, which I love. Personally, I love. He gets up. He, like, wipes the blood from his nose on her face, like in 2 streaks across her cheek, and gets his diamond back from her, like threatens to kill her if she doesn't give the diamond back. She makes a run for it to try and find Doreen and just go home. So she couldn't find Doreen, and she ends up just like walking home. And when she gets there, she goes up into her hotel room and she takes all of her clothes to the rooftop. Piece by piece, I fed my wardrobe to the night wind, and flutteringly, like a loved one's ashes, the gray scraps were ferried off to settle here, there, exactly where I would never know, into the dark heart of New York. And so that's how she ends her New York trip, which is a lot and very sad. And so in chapter 10, we're getting into the 50% mark of the book. Her time at New York has ended. She's on the bus. She had to borrow clothes from Betsy because she had thrown all of her clothes off of the roof. Like, she didn't have any more daytime clothes. So she borrows a blouse and skirt from Betsy. She gets on the train to go home. She never washed the blood off of her face, being cognizant of like not making any type of facial reactions or smiling or talking. Like, she would talk through her teeth to make sure that she wouldn't flex any muscles in her face to flake off any of the blood. She wanted it to come off naturally. And yeah, just, it's a lot. This is just, I don't even know how to unpack any of it necessarily. Like, I just know there's so much to unpack in such a way that I can't express, but I just need to share it, which is like how I feel with a lot of these things. And so, yeah, I'm just telling you a story, man. What you do with any of this is kind of what you do and how you interpret it. I mean, well, again, I'll unpack a lot of this more toward the end, but like, oh my God, dude, my chest the whole time just like ached for this woman. And so when she gets to the car, her mom picks her up. She tries to play it off with her mom and immediately hops in the back seat so her mom won't see the blood on her face. And she's like, "Yeah, I got a cut. Don't worry about it." Doesn't tell her what happened at all. This like whole situation with Marco does not get brought up again for the rest of the book, okay? Completely swept under the rug. So her mom is in the car with her. Immediately, her mom says, "I think I should tell you something right away. You didn't make that riding course." The air punched out of my stomach. All through June, the riding course had stretched before me like a bright, safe bridge over the dull gulf of the summer. Now I saw it totter and dissolve. My mouth shaped itself sourly. I had expected it. So this is the beginning of her spiral. Like, this is I would argue, like the formal beginning. We've had kind of the traces of it through the ending. I think getting to New York and like attaining such like high levels and stuff, and the realization of like still not feeling enough, still not having answers to what you wanted to do, not having a good time, feeling detached, and knowing that you shouldn't be too blessed to be ungrateful for it all. It's a Caramel by Sleep Token quote, but that's like the perfect thing for this right now. She knows that she should feel grateful and happy for everything that she has. I think it might have been earlier that it gets talked about. Yeah, I think it was earlier. She made a reference to her college, and there had been a what's the term for it? Almost like a donor. There was a famous writer that she had written to, this woman, and she was like, "Hey, I, respect and admire you. I want to be just like you, bop, bop, bop." And that woman funded her going to college, right? That was who she kind of referenced in passing in one of the passages that I read about like somebody vouching for her to get into the master's programs. It's that woman. She has been like this stand-in supporter of Esther. She knows she should be happy and grateful for everything that woman's done, for the opportunities she has had, and for everything. But to have all of that and to know you should be happy and you're not is like an extra triple whammy on everything of just like feeling even worse. Oh God. And so then, so that was the beginning of it. And then to get home and to now, not only are you not grateful for what you did have, but also now you're not good enough to have the things that you did actually really want and that you were looking forward to. And all of a sudden, all of the work and her 19 years of effort and 100%ing everything and going above and beyond has been for nothing, right? That's a lot to come to terms with when you have made that your entire personality and your entire life and you're not fulfilled in any way and there is no next step. I felt so much of this piece of it so deep down in my soul. And when she is home, she is like kind of curling up in bed and just avoiding everything and just being in her room all day. And there's this one neighbor woman, her name is Dodo. Everybody loved Dodo, although the swelling size of her family was the talk of the neighborhood. The older people around, like my mother, had 2 children, and the younger, more prosperous ones had 4. But nobody but Dodo was on the verge of a 7th. Even 6 was considered excessive. But then everybody said, of course, Dodo was a Catholic. And so there's this whole thing where she looks down on this woman for the amount of children that she has, for this like motherhood thing. But also internally, she's like, I don't know why I don't feel this urge for motherhood. There's almost this like, and this happens with a lot of these characters, there's almost this like judgment and I'm better than, but also I'm kind of jealous. And so I would argue that there is a superiority thing that comes across of like, oh, well, I'm better than her. But it's also, I have to tell myself that so that I'm not just jealous of her. It's a lot better to feel that I'm making these decisions on purpose rather than missing out on stuff. I hope that makes sense. In all of this, she has a couple more letters. She opens them. Since I wasn't accepted into the writing course, it said I could choose to do some other course instead. But I should call into the admissions office that same morning or it would be too late to register. The courses were almost full. I dialed the administration's office and listened to the zombie voice leave a message that Miss Esther Greenwood was canceling all arrangements to come to the summer school. Then I opened Buddy Willard's letter. Buddy wrote that he was probably falling in love with a nurse who also had TB, but his mother had rented a cottage in the Adirondacks for the month of July, and if I came along with her, he might well find his feeling for the nurse was mere infatuation. She snatches up a pencil, she writes on the back of Buddy's message, and pretty much tells him to F off, and goes to mail it back to him. And then I decided I would spend the summer writing a novel. That would fix a lot of people. And in that particular one makes me want to cry so bad. Because I think so much of this is like autobiographical of Sylvia. And there's some stories and stuff too about like people who did go to school with her, who were in these programs with her that she wrote about. Like literally all she did was change some names. Like a lot of this is based on real life experiences of hers with very small twists of fiction just to, add a flair or tell a story. From what I've read, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody really knows how legitimate all of this is, but there's this belief that it is pretty freaking accurate to her experiences. And so there's a weird like meta thing happening where she's writing about Esther wanting to write a book that hurts so bad knowing how quickly she passed away after this book got published. And then to also say that it would fix a lot of people, and then to have like the impact that this book has had is so sad, dude. That's so sad. And so she's thinking about the character that she wants to write. A feeling of tenderness filled my heart. My heroine would be myself, only in disguise. She would be called Elaine. Elaine. I counted the letters on my fingers. There were 6 letters in Esther, too. It seemed a lucky thing. There's also 6 letters in Sylvia. But she's having trouble writing it. At this rate, I would be lucky if I wrote a page a day. Then I knew what the trouble was. I needed experience. How could I write about a life when I had never had an affair or a baby or even seen anybody die? A girl I knew had just won a prize for a short story about her adventures in Africa. How could I compete with that sort of thing? I decided I would put off the novel until I had gone to Europe and had a lover, and then I would never learn a word of shorthand. If I never learned shorthand, I would never have to use it. And so she's thinking about all the things she could do, right? She could put off college for a year, go to Europe, work her way through Germany, and be a waitress until she was bilingual. Then plan after plan started leaping through my head like a family of scatty rabbits. I saw the years of my life spaced along a road in the form of telephone poles, threaded together by wires. I counted 1, 2, 3, 19 telephone poles, and then the wires dangled in space, and try as I would, I couldn't see a single pole beyond the 19. She starts thinking about changing majors, and so she's looking at other degree programs and other universities, and she does not qualify for any of them. Because the program that she was in honors classes, so she could take different kind of specialty classes and have certain stuff waived, and kind of had this like very flexible program that now when she's looking to change it, it's not an option. She doesn't meet any of the requirements. Now I saw that the stupidest person at my mother's college, she used to look down on her mother's university, the stupidest person at my mother's college knew more than I did. I saw they wouldn't even let me through the door, let alone give me a large scholarship like the one I had at my own college. I thought I'd better go to work for a year and think things over. Maybe I could study 18th century in secret. But I didn't know shorthand, so what could I do? I could be a waitress or a typist, but I couldn't stand the idea of being either one. So she asks to go to see the doctor to talk about what is going on and to ask for additional sleeping pills. The doctor that she has is like, hey, you already have some really, really strong ones. I can't help. And so the doctor says, hey, I think you need to go and talk to somebody else, like a more professional specialty doctor. And so in chapter 11, she's introduced to Dr. Gordon. I hadn't washed my hair for 3 weeks. I hadn't slept for 7 nights. My mother told me that I must have slept. It was impossible to not sleep in all that time, but if I slept, it was with my eyes wide open. For I had followed the green luminous course of the second hand and the minute hand and the hour hand on the bedside clock through their circles and semicircles every night for 7 nights, without missing a second, a minute, or an hour. The reason I hadn't washed my clothes or my hair was because it seemed so silly. I saw the days of the years stretching ahead like a series of bright white boxes. Separating one box from another was sleep like a black shade. Only for me, the long perspective of shades that set off one box from the next had suddenly snapped up. I could see day after day after day glaring ahead of me like a white, broad, infinitely desolate avenue. It seemed silly to wash one day when I would only have to wash again the next. It made me tired just to think of it. I wanted to do everything once and for all and be through with it. And so when Dr. Gordon comes in the room, I hated him the minute he walked through the door. I had imagined a kind, ugly, intuitive man looking up at me and saying, in an encouraging way, as if he could see something I couldn't. And then I would find words to tell him how I was so scared, as if I were being stuffed farther and farther into a black, airless sack with no way out. Then he would lean back in his chair and match the tips of his fingers together in a little steeple and tell me why I couldn't sleep, and why I couldn't read, and why I couldn't eat, and why everything people did seemed so silly, because they only died in the end. And then I thought he would help me, step by step, to be myself again. But Dr. Gordon wasn't like that at all. He was young and good-looking, and I could see right away that he was conceited. And so he asks her what she thinks is wrong, and that made it sound as if nothing was really wrong. I only thought it was wrong. And so she makes some comments to him, and then he's like, oh, what college did you go to? After she's done rattling off all of these things, and she tells him, and he's like, yeah, those are some real pretty girls that go there. And then he stands up, shakes her hand, and says, I'll see you next week. So she goes out to the car. I could see my mother's face, anxious and sallow as a slice of lemon, peering at me through the windshield. Well, what did he say? I pulled the car door shut. It didn't catch. I pushed it out and drew it in again with a dull slam. He said he'll see me next week. My mother sighed. Dr. Gordon cost $25 an hour, which is insanely expensive, by the way, for that time. That would be $270 in 2025 money. And so later on, next day, couple days, whatever, she's out and about and ends up running into a guy and telling him that she's from Chicago. Gives a fake name. It's the same fake name that she gave to Lenny and some other guys when she was in New York. I thought if I ever did get to Chicago, I might change my name to Ellie Higginbottom for good. Then nobody would know that I had thrown up a scholarship at a big Eastern women's college and mucked up a month in New York and refused a perfectly solid medical student for a husband who would one day be a member of the AMA and earn pots of money. In Chicago, people would take me for what I was. I would be simple Ellie Higginbottom, the orphan. People would love me for my sweet, quiet nature. They wouldn't be after me to read books and write long papers on the twins and James Joyce. And one day, I might just marry a lively but tender garage mechanic and have a big family like Dodo Conway, if I happened to feel like it. A whole bunch of back and forth with this guy. Then we cut back to another doctor's appointment with Dr. Gordon, and she gets snippy with him because he, again, is just being incredibly dismissive of all of her concerns. And then eventually he's like, hey, I need to talk to your mom. So her mom comes in, talks to the doctor, and then comes back out and tells Esther what's going on. Dr. Gordon doesn't think that you've improved at all. He thinks that you should have some shock treatments at his private hospital in Walton. She's like, are you sure, like, not live there? Like, you're not having me committed? Mom says, no, I promise. He just wants to give you some shock treatments and see if it helps. And so this begins. It's kind of been trickled throughout, this like kind of obsession with death. And then now we're opening the door to this casual obsession of like reading various news articles and thinking about people taking their own lives. And this is where I'm going to share something with you. Because like I said, we're about to get into the more darker chapters of the book. And good time as any to talk about this very particular thing. So trigger warning, again, we're getting into the darker half of the book where like suicide is going to be talked about a lot more and a lot more heavily, along with like self-harming and other things. I will brush over it as much as I like possibly humanly can while still telling you the story. Like I'm not going to be detailed about a lot of it. However, right, this is the beginning of her kind of obsession with people ending their own lives. And so this first one that she has cited in here is somebody who is going to jump off of a building, and they got saved by like a bystander or like a off-duty cop or something that talked them off of the ledge, quite literally. And so I would like to take a moment and read something to you from BoJack Horseman. I referenced this TV show in one or two of my videos recently, but it's my favorite show of all time. I'm currently rewatching it. It's very heavy on my mind. There is a particular poem that gets shared toward the end of the series. So I'm just going to read it to you now. It is related to all of this, but also like before we get in again into talking about this like super ideation, I just want to have this as like our little caveat beginner note, okay? So the view from halfway down. The weak breeze whispers nothing. The water screams sublime. His feet shift teeter-totter. Deep breath, stand back, it's time. Toes untouch the overpass. Soon he's water-bound. Eyes locked shut, but peaked to see the view from halfway down. A little wind, a summer sun. A river rich and regal, a flood of fond endorphins, bring a calm that knows no equal. You're flying now, you see things much more clear than from the ground. It's all okay, or it would be, were you not now halfway down. Thrashed to break from gravity, what now could slow the drop? All I'd give for those toes to touch the safety back at top. But this is it. The deed is done, silence drowns the sound. Before I leaped, I should have seen the view from halfway down. I really should have thought about the view from halfway down. I wish I could have known about the view from halfway down. That is arguably from one of the saddest episodes in television history, like one of the eeriest, saddest things ever. That particular poem always makes me bawl my eyes out when it gets performed in the show itself. But the point being, hey, if you're having these types of ideations and thoughts and whatnot, there are resources and things do get better. As much as it doesn't feel that way, it really, truly, genuinely does. And I'll have things in the description box below. Read, Rant, Review, like as a community, I do a community donation once a month. With the like revenue I receive from the channel, it'll be going to a suicide prevention organization or hotline or something. I'll have to do some research in the next couple of days to pick the organization, but we're donating to that. And I just wanted to say like, hey man, like there's stuff out there. Like I said, I'll have resources in the description box, but just want to say it out loud. It gets better. And I'm glad you're here, right? Like I'm thankful that you're here. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that are as well, even though it might not feel that way. Not that that fixes anything either. Like people being grateful for you doesn't make those feelings go away. I'm not trying to invalidate any of that either, but I'm just saying. And so with that, they're off to Walton, the private hospital. And the whole time that they're driving, she's thinking about how she could have run away. I had no idea how much it would cost to get to Chicago, and I didn't dare go to the bank and draw out all my money because I thought Dr. Gordon might well have warned the bank clerk to intercept me had I made any obvious move. Hitchhiking occurred to me, but I had no idea which of the routes out of Boston led to Chicago. It's easy enough to find directions on a map, but I had very little knowledge of directions when I was smack in the middle of somewhere. I decided to walk to the bus terminal and inquire about fares to Chicago. Then I might go to the bank and withdraw precisely that amount, which would not cause so much suspicion. But I had just strolled in through the glass doors of the terminal and was browsing over the rack of colored tour leaflets and schedules when I realized that the bank in my hometown would be closed, as it was already mid-afternoon and I couldn't get any money out till the next day. My appointment at Walton was for 10 o'clock. And so in chapter 12, she's at the hospital going through everything and ends up getting the electroshock therapy, right? So they put the little electric nodes on each side of her head, and it does not go correctly. It is horrifically painful. It is not administered properly. And even administered properly, there's like a whole bunch of issues with it, whatever. But this one in particular was just like really, 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 really bad. And I wondered what terrible thing it was I had just done. They take her out of the room, take her back out to her mother in the waiting room, and they say, "A few more shock treatments, Mrs. Greenwood," I heard Dr. Gordon say, "and I think you'll notice a wonderful improvement." So they get in the car, and the first thing that Esther says to her mother is, "I'm through with Dr. Gordon. You can call him up and tell him that I'm not coming next week." My mother smiled. "I knew my baby wasn't like that." I looked at her. "Like what?" "Like those awful people, those awful dead people at the hospital." She paused. "I knew you would decide to be all right again." Oh, this is so sad. And then she goes on to, there's like some details about some self-harming, and details all of the various ways that she goes on to try to commit suicide over the next couple of weeks, and some other just kind of random journeys that she goes on through this like depression episode that she's having. And in one of them, she's going out to where she grew up at, which now is next to this prison property. Ends up walking too close to the prison. She's like on the beach and like walks up too close to the prison, and one of the guards stops her. And they get to talking a little bit, and turns out he also grew up in this area. And I was thinking that if I'd had the sense to go on living in that old town, I might just have met this prison guard in school and married him and had a parcel of kids by now. It would be nice, living by the sea with piles of little kids and pigs and chickens, wearing what my grandmother called wash dresses, and sitting about in some kitchen with bright linoleum and fat arms drinking pots of coffee. Again, just thinking of all of these various futures that she could have, right? This whole fig tree thing. Also just a constant through the book of like the what ifs. Sitting on the beach and is waiting for the tide to take her, essentially. I waited as if the sea could make my decision for me. A second wave collapsed over my feet, lipped with white froth, and the chill gripped my ankles with a mortal ache. My flesh winced in cowardice from such a death. I picked up my pocketbook and started back over the cold stones to where my shoes had kept their vigil in the violet light. Because she had taken her shoes off, because she was wearing heels at the beach. She had taken them off, and then she was like sitting on the shoreline for hours. And this one kid had told her to go away because the tide was rising. He's like, "You don't want to be down here, lady." She was going to let the tide take her away, and then she couldn't because her body was protecting itself. And that's pretty much what the entirety of chapter 13 is her body protecting itself. She goes on a date, her child friend Jody, her boyfriend, and then this guy Cal that she's trying to set her up with. Cal was supposed to be very intelligent, and Jody said over the phone that he was cute and that I would like him. I wondered if I had been my old self, if I would have liked him. It was impossible to tell. They go on talking about a whole bunch of things, and he's talking about this one particular play that he had seen. The only reason that I remembered this play was because it had a mad person in it, and everything I ever read about mad people stuck in my mind, while everything else flew out, which I also found relatable. She ends up challenging Cal to swim out to this rock that's like a mile out into the ocean, again with the idea of drowning herself. I thought I would swim out until I was too tired to swim back, and as I paddled on, my heartbeat boomed like a dulled motor in my ears. I am. Another attempt on her own life. Then I saw my body had all sorts of little tricks, such as making my hands go limp at the crucial second, which would save it time and time again, whereas if I had the whole say, I would be dead in a flash. I would simply have to ambush it with whatever sense I had left, or it would trap me in its stupid cage for 50 years without any sense at all. And when people found out my mind had gone, as they would have to, sooner or later, in spite of my mother's guarded tongue, they would persuade her to put me into an asylum where I could be cured. Only my case was incurable. I had bought a few paperbacks on abnormal psychology at the drugstore and compared my symptoms with the symptoms in the books. And sure enough, my symptoms tallied with the most hopeless cases. I wondered after the last fiasco if I shouldn't just give it up and turn myself over to the doctors. And then I remembered Dr. Gordon and his private shock machine. Once I was locked up, they could use that on me all the time. And I thought about how my mother and my brother and friends would visit me day after day, hoping that I would be better. Then their visits would slacken off and they would give up hope. They would grow old. They would forget me. They would be poor, too. They would want me to have the best care at first, and so they would sink all of their money in a private hospital like Dr. Gordon's. Finally, when the money was used up, I would be moved to a state hospital with hundreds of people like me in a big cage in the basement. The more hopeless you were, the further away they hid you. Little chunk. My mother said the cure for thinking too much about yourself was helping somebody who was worse off than you. So they had arranged for her to be a volunteer at the hospital. They end up putting her on the maternity ward, and she's in charge of delivering flowers. She tries to do a nice thing and like take the dead flowers out of the bouquets, and then some of them looked a little skimpy, so she kind of rearranged the flowers so that they were all like equally beautiful and stuff. But obviously, when she goes to pass those out, people are pissed off because they're like, I was supposed to have this one particular flower. What's all this weird stuff in my bouquet? The whole thing. So she like runs out of the hospital like embarrassed and just mortified. And it gets to a point where she also says, lately I had considered going into the Catholic Church myself. I knew that Catholics thought that killing yourself was an awful sin, but perhaps if that was so, they might have a good way to persuade me out of it. Good God. Of course, I didn't believe in life after death or the virgin birth, but I didn't have to let this priest see this. I could just concentrate on my sin and he would help me repent. The only trouble was, church, even the Catholic Church, didn't take up the whole of your life. No matter how much you knelt and prayed, you still had to eat 3 meals a day and have a job and live in the world. And then she goes on to think about like religion in general, and it leads to her father and her visiting his grave. He died when she was very, very young, which is also like a parallel to Sylvia's life. And so she goes and visits her dad's grave. I thought that if my father hadn't died, he would have taught me all about insects, which was his specialty at the university. He would also have taught me German and Greek and Latin, which he knew, and perhaps I would be a Lutheran. My father had been a Lutheran in Wisconsin, but they were out of style in New England, so he had become a lapsed Lutheran. And then my mother said, a bitter atheist. She goes to the graveyard. She can't find her father's gravestone. It starts to rain. She goes over to buy a raincoat. They offer an umbrella. She can't afford it. She's like running out of all of the money that she earned in New York because she's just been living off of it. I hadn't had enough money for the umbrella. What with bus fare in and out of Boston and peanuts and newspapers and abnormal psychology books and trips to my old hometown by the sea, my New York fund was almost exhausted. I had decided that when there was no more money in my bank account, I would do it. And that morning, I'd spent the last of it on a black raincoat. And then I saw my father's gravestone. So she goes and visits the gravestone. She's like sobbing uncontrollably. She had never cried over her father's death before, so it's like all coming out right now. The very next morning, when her mother goes to work, she goes to get all of her sleeping pills. Her mother keeps them like locked away in the closet and only gives them to her one at a time. She breaks off the lock. She takes all of these sleeping pills, and in chapter 14, she's dealing with the aftermath of that. So she crawled under into a little crawl space under the house with her raincoat, covered up the hole with like the firewood and stuff, and then took all of the medication with the hopes of like dying in this like darkness. One of the things, I don't think many of my quotes have talked about it, but there's been a lot of talk of shadows and finding comfort in them, but it's like the comfort of darkness and shadows and being like bundled up and like hiding and whole things. I don't think I ended up actually highlighting the passages where it came up, or maybe it's later, but it's really this like symbolic thing throughout the entire book that is very, very like beautiful. But in this instance, right, we're dealing with the darkness after an attempt like this and like almost dying, and she ends up waking up in a hospital in so much pain. She doesn't remember how she got there. Everything sucks. She called up for her mother, passes out again, wakes back up. Her mom is there with her brother. So he came back from Germany, probably specifically to come and see her. I think he wasn't supposed to come back for like another 2 months or something, but he's there now. And her brother asks, "How are you?" I looked my mother in the eye. "The same," I said. And then she has a visitor like the next day or later on, and it's some random guy that she went to high school with, or like some friend of a guy she went on a date with. He didn't really know me either. He just wanted to see what a girl who's crazy enough to kill herself looked like. I turned my face to the wall. "Get the hell out," I said. "Get the hell out and don't come back." And then she goes on to ask for a mirror eventually. The person says, "No, you don't want to see yourself right now. You don't look very pretty." She says, "Oh, just let me see." The nurse sighed and opened up the top drawer. She took out a large mirror in a wooden frame that matched the wood of the bureau and handed it to me. At first, I didn't see what the trouble was. It wasn't a mirror at all, but a picture. You couldn't tell whether the person in the picture was man or woman because their hair was shaved off and sprouted in tiny, bristly chicken feather tufts all over their head. One side of the person's face was purple and bulged out in a shapeless way, shading to green along the edges and then a sallow yellow. The person's mouth was pale brown with a rose-colored sore at either corner. And she realizes that it's her. She ends up throwing the mirror and breaking it. And so she ends up getting kicked out of that hospital for acting out. She moves to another hospital, whole bunch of doctors and like student doctors, residents or whatever, they come in and talk to her. And they ask her what's going on. She says, I can't sleep. They interrupted me, but the nurse says you slept last night. I looked around the crescent of fresh, strange faces. I can't read. I raised my voice. I can't eat. It occurred to me that I had been eating ravenously ever since I came to. She ends up moving to another hospital. And she starts to go through maybe a little bit of paranoia. We've had this happening a little bit where she's had maybe some indicators of some hallucinations, like auditory hallucinations and like kind of visual hallucinations throughout the book. And then now she's getting to a point of paranoia where she feels like everybody is lying to her about everything. And so be it, she may just be in like a mental health facility where they don't give out real names. She's also saying that they call themselves Dr. Syphilis and Dr. Pancreas. Is it valid? Is she just like feeling freaky outy? Is there some other things going on? Who knows? She ends up, and then this was the part of the book that I felt really, really uncomfortable because there is like a negative reference to one of the workers who is black, and it is used a lot. A lot. And then she ends up kicking him in the shin at the very end. I drew back my foot and gave him a sharp, hard kick on the calf of the leg, saying, that's what you get. I said, and I stared him in the eye. Now, this is in reference to this worker giving them 2 types of beans. And her thing saying, like, they don't ever give you 2 types of beans. You get beans and carrots or beans and corn. But to give you green beans and baked beans, they must be testing me. And this feeds into the whole paranoia thing I'm talking about. And so she's like, oh, this is a test and this worker is trying to make me look stupid or like do something bad. And so she kicks them, assumably. But it also reads that it could be maybe a little racist. I don't know. It's just kind of uncomfortable the way that this person is talked about. And so just like really, really weird there, you know, we gotta at least acknowledge it here. And so the next day, it's kind of business as usual. The nurse comes in and is taking her temperature. And she says, you see, normal. I had looked at the thermometer before she came to collect it the way I always did. You see, it's normal. What do you keep taking it for? I wanted to tell her that if only something were wrong with my body, it would be fine. I would rather have anything wrong with my body than something wrong with my head. But the idea seemed so involved and wearisome that I didn't say anything. I only burrowed further down in the bed. So then she ends up kicking a tray off of her bed and just causing more trouble. Like, she is just completely acting out in all of these instances. And then in chapter 15, Philomena Guinea turns up. That is the woman who paid for Esther to go to college and this like benefactor person who has like invested in her. I wasn't quite sure why Miss Guinea had turned up. All I knew was that she had interested herself in my case and that at one time, at the peak of her career, she had been in an asylum as well. My mother said that Mrs. Guinea had sent her a telegram from the Bahamas, where she read about me in a Boston paper. Mrs. Guinea had telegrammed, is there a boy in the case? If there was a boy in the case, Mrs. Guinea couldn't, of course, have anything to do with it. But my mother telegrammed back, no, it is Esther's writing. She thinks she will never write again. So Mrs. Guinea had flown back to Boston and taken me out of the cramped city hospital ward, and now she was driving me to a private hospital that had grounds and golf courses and gardens like a country club, where she would pay for me, as if I had a scholarship, until the doctors she knew of there had made me well. My mother told me that I should be grateful. She said that I had used up almost all of her money, and that if it weren't for Mrs. Guinea, she didn't know where I would be. I knew where I'd be, though. I'd be in the big state hospital in the country. I knew I should be grateful for Mrs. Guinea, only I couldn't feel a thing. If Mrs. Guinea had given me a ticket to Europe or a round-the-world cruise, it wouldn't have made one scrap of difference to me. Because wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. So they get to this hospital. She goes in and she's introduced to her doctor, and her name is Dr. Nolan, and she's a young woman. And Esther is surprised to have a woman. I didn't think that they had women psychiatrists. And so this is the beginning of making a huge difference in terms of her like psychiatric treatment, because very clearly Earlier on, Dr. Gordon, being a man, being a conceited, selfish, all about himself man, did not care about her problems and completely wrote her off as just having lady troubles and jumped immediately to electrotherapy treatments instead of hearing her out in any way, shape, or form. Right. And so now it's like, okay, so if we have like a female doctor, maybe she'll be more understanding, more helpful, more like genuinely invested and caring about what's going on with Esther. She gets a tour of the facility and she asks one of the nurses where all of the people are. I walked back to the lounge. I couldn't understand what these people were doing, playing badminton and golf. They mustn't really be all that sick to be doing all of that. I sat down near Valerie, who's one of the patients, and observed her carefully. Yes, I thought she might just as well be at Girl Scout camp. She was reading her tatty copy of Vogue with intense interest. What the hell is she doing here? I wondered. There's nothing the matter with her. So even Esther herself, who was in New York and doing all this stuff and suffering from depression, is judgmental of all of these people who are and doing things while also still having mental illness. And so it's like the realization isn't there that she is also part of the problem, or like perpetuating the problem of the mental like illness and like awareness and whatnot and acceptance and like understanding. Definitely not a mirror being placed in front of her right now, which is kind of crazy, but it is what it is. Eventually, she ends up having a sit down with Dr. Nolan, and she asks about the experience with Dr. Gordon, the male, and she asks if she liked him, and Esther says, no, I didn't like him at all. That's interesting. Why? I didn't like what he did to me. Did to you? I told Dr. Nolan about the machine and the blue flashes and the jolting and the noise. While I was telling her, she went very still. That was a mistake, she said. It's not supposed to be like that. I stared at her. If done properly, Dr. Nolan said, it's like going to sleep. If anyone does that to me again, I'll kill myself. Dr. Nolan said firmly, you won't have any shock treatments here. Or if you do, I'll tell you about it beforehand, and I promise you it won't be anything like what you had before. Why, some people even like them. She goes on to meet a couple other patients, kind of falls into the routine at the hospital, talks to one of the women who had a lobotomy. And this is all just like so, I hate reading about this stuff because it just like breaks my heart so bad. Like all of these freaking barbaric, insane treatments is just so sad. The sheer number of women and people in general that like went through these types of things. I'm just like, oh my God. And Esther asks how the woman feels. And she says, fine, I'm not angry anymore. Before I was always angry. I was in Weimar, which is the more like extreme mental hospital, like the you're really not doing well before. And now I'm in Kaplan, which is like the middle ground one of like you're doing pretty good, but you're not great. And I can go to town now or shopping or to a movie along with a nurse. What will you do when you get out? I asked. Oh, I'm not leaving. Valerie laughed. I like it here. So she has no intention of leaving, right? She's fine and dandy where she is. Is it part of the lobotomy? Is it part of complacency? I don't know. But Esther gets moved to another room in the hospital, like to the front of it because it has like better light or something. And then at the very end of the chapter, she ends up running into Joan. Joan is also in the asylum. If you don't remember, Joan is the woman that went to the sophomore Yale prom with Buddy, and they kind of know each other from way long time ago, right? And so in chapter 16, Esther starts talking to Joan and she's like, how did you even get here? Like, what are you even doing here? She goes on to tell Esther about how she had this like really horrible summer job. She ended up quitting and like isolating herself and then contemplating like suicide. She ended up getting committed to like a local hospital, and they sent her to group therapy, and the two of them absolutely balk about how horrible of an idea group therapy is. And then she ended up like after that whole group therapy debacle and like not being happy with it, she left really, really upset that they would even offer such a thing. She ended up coming home and finding a newspaper article about Esther and about Esther's attempts. Scholarship girl missing, mother worried, sleeping pills feared missing with girl found alive. And then there's a bunch of readings of the clippings of each of the news articles. I read about you, Joan went on, not how they found you, but everything up to that. And I put all my money together and I took the first plane to New York. Why New York? Oh, I thought it would be easier to kill myself in New York. And then goes on about how she tried to end her life there. And then she ends up in the same hospital as Esther. In chapter 17, Esther gets upgraded to Belsize. This is the ward for the women that are slated for release. So this is like the final stage. Joan was moving out of the room. So Esther was moving into Joan's room at the previous one at Kaplan. Now both of them are there together, right? But the point being, Joan has always been just a little bit ahead of Esther's healing. Joan had walk privileges. Joan had shopping privileges, town privileges. I gathered all of my news of Joan into a little bitter heap. Though I received it with surface gladness, Joan was the beaming double of my old best self, specially designed to follow and torment me. Perhaps Joan would be gone when I got to Belsize. And that was, in fact, not the case. And it's her, there's a woman named Dee Dee, Lou Bell, a whole bunch of people, and they're all just kind of like hanging around and talking, and it's more like a sorority thing where everyone's just kind of hanging out, more so than it feels like an actual hospital. And one of the nights, Joan is flipping through a magazine and comes across a spread that Esther was in, and they're like, oh my God, this is you? This is so crazy. And it's like this just slap in the face to Esther about who she used to be. Like, she doesn't even recognize herself of this life that she used to have and what could have been and whatnot. So the next day, Esther does not get breakfast. Every morning throughout this entire time, the nurses bring them trays of breakfast. And if you don't get your breakfast tray, that means that you're getting one of the electroshock treatments, like one of the therapy sessions. And so when she doesn't get that tray that day, she's like, there has to be a mistake. I'm not, nope. Dr. Nolan didn't come and talk to me about it. I know this is not happening right now. She said that would not happen to me, but it is. I curled up in the far corner of the alcove with the blanket over my head. It wasn't the shock treatment that struck me so much as it was the barefaced treachery of Dr. Nolan. I liked Dr. Nolan. I loved her. I'd given her my trust on a platter and told her everything, and she promised faithfully to warn me ahead of time if I ever had to have another shock treatment. Dr. Nolan comes in to comfort her, and she says, you said you would tell me. Listen, Esther, Dr. Nolan said, I'm going over with you. I'll be there the whole time, so everything will happen right, the way that I promised. I'll be there when you wake up, and I'll bring you back again. Promise you'll be there. I promise. And so she goes over, she gets the shock treatment, and this time it's exactly as Dr. Nolan says, where it just feels like she goes to sleep. In chapter 18, she wakes up from this. I woke out of a deep, drenched sleep, and the first thing I saw was Dr. Nolan's face swimming in front of me and saying, Esther? Esther. I rubbed my eyes together with an awkward hand. All the heat and fear had purged itself. I felt surprisingly at peace. The bell jar hung, suspended a few feet above my head. I was open to the circulating air. She says that she feels better, and the doctor says you will be having shock treatments 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I gulped in a long draught of air. For how long? That depends, Dr. Nolan said, on you and me. Cut to a little while later, she's hanging out in her room and Joan comes in chanting about how she got a letter. Good for you. I kept my eyes on my book ever since the shock treatments had ended. After a brief series of 5, and I had town privileges, Joan hung about me like a large and breathless fruit fly, as if the sweetness of recovery were something that she would suck up by mere nearness. They had taken away her physics books and the piles of dusty spiral pads full of lecture notes that had ringed her room, and she was confined to the grounds again. I.e., Joan is not doing very well, right? She relapsed a little bit, and so she had some privileges taken away, but Esther is still doing good. The letter that she got in the mail, turns out Esther got the same one, and it's from Buddy Willard, the guy that both of them dated. It's about how he's doing better, and so they ask each other, they're like, are you gonna marry him? Esther says, no. Are you gonna marry him? Joan says, no, but I do miss his family. Like his family, you know, like his mom was so sweet to me, and his parents were so good, like parents I never had, and I'm going to maybe invite him and ask him to bring his mom and like have them come and visit though, because I miss her. And then at some point she knocks on Dee Dee, which is one of the other women that are there, knocks on her door to get some sheet music from her room to play on the piano. Dee Dee usually plays the piano. Esther's just kind of feeling motivated. Hey, this is good. That's like a sign of healing, right? She's like wanting to do something. She's wanting to go into Dee Dee's room and get the sheet music, but the door is shut. The doors don't lock at the ward for obvious reasons, but a door being shut is like the everybody respects it thing. Like you don't go into people's rooms. She ignores it though because she wants this music. And so when she opens up the door, she sees some shadows moving on the bed. I know, said Dee Dee, the music. Hello, Esther, Joan said then, and her cornhusk voice made me want to puke. Wait for me, Esther. I'll come play the bottom part with you. Now Joan said stoutly, I'd never really liked Buddy Willard. He thought he knew everything. He thought he knew everything about women. I looked at Joan. In spite of the creepy feeling, in spite of my old ingrained dislike, Joan fascinated me. It was like observing a Martian or a particularly warty toad. Her thoughts were not my thoughts, nor her feelings my feelings, but we were close enough so that her thoughts and feelings seemed a wry black image of my own. Sometimes I wondered if I had made Joan up. Other times I wondered if she would continue to pop in at every crisis of my life to remind me of what I had been, and what I had been through, and carry on her own separate but similar crisis under my nose. I don't see what women see in other women, I told Dr. Nolan in my interview that noon. What does a woman see in a woman that she can't see in a man? Dr. Nolan paused, and then she said, tenderness. That shut me up. I like you. Joan was saying, I like you better than Buddy, as she stretched out on my bed with a silly smile. I like you. Joan said, that's tough, I said, picking up my book, because I don't like you. You make me want to puke if you want to know. And I walked out of the room, leaving Joan lying, lumpy as an old horse, across my bed. And so this is also the part where people are questioning if this was like a homophobic thing, if after because the timing of it, again, is like a little questionable and kind of weird. If this happened immediately after she found out that Joan and Dee Dee were having a relationship, and then it's like, okay, so is this stemming from homophobia? But also she kind of acknowledged Dr. Nolan's response about a woman seeking tenderness from another woman. So is this out of like a jealousy response? Is this out of the whole like Joan being my opposite of who I could be and would be, and if she's a lesbian, then like that's the dark part of me, so there's this like internalized hatred for that, an internalized homophobia, recognizing that maybe she has feelings for women, because there were some crazy descriptions about the way that she talked about Doreen, like definitely some questionably, you know what I'm saying, attraction there. And so I don't know. I don't know if that's I don't think this is like an outright homophobic thing. I think this is like a misplaced, like internalized one. I guess technically it is, but I think it is her liking women and not knowing how to come to terms with it, especially with the way that she talks about sex and being so checked out of it when talking about men, and just the way that she talks about men compared to the way that she talks about women. But who knows? Right? I don't know. Who knows anything? I'm just making observations, right? It's all just very, very interesting. And so all of this leads to Esther making an appointment to go to a doctor to get fitted for, I don't think the name is ever said on here, but it's like a birth control insert thing. A diaphragm, I think is the word for it, to go and get fitted for this. And so the $5 that she used to pay for this was part of Philomena Guineas had sent me as a sort of get well present, and I wondered what she would think if she knew what her money was being used for. She knew it or not, she was buying my freedom. What I hate is the idea of being under a man's thumb, I had told Dr. Nolan. A man doesn't have a worry in the world while I've got a baby hanging over my head like a big stick to keep me in line. Jesus Christ, dude. Would you act differently if you didn't have to worry about a baby? Yes, I said, and I told Dr. Nolan about the married woman lawyer and her defense of chastity. Dr. Nolan waited until I was finished, and then she burst out laughing. Propaganda, she said, and scribbled the name and address of this doctor on a prescription pad. See, so there's this like acknowledgement of this like feminist movement, right? Like even then there was this acknowledge of this purity talk being a little crazy. Oh, it all just hurts me. It all just hurts so bad. And so she's in this like gynecologist office. She's seeing all of these like, you know, pregnant women and pamphlets and things about babies everywhere. And she's thinking to herself, how easy having babies seemed to be to the women around me. Why was I so unmaternal and apart? Why couldn't I dream of devoting myself to babies the way that Dodo Conway had? If I had to wait on a baby all day, I would go mad. I climbed up on the examination table thinking I am climbing to freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from marrying the wrong person like Buddy Willard just because of sex. I had done well by my shopping privileges, I thought. I was my own woman. The next step was to find the proper sort of man. Oh my God. That's so crazy. This idea of like independence, and like not to be all like TMI and weird about it, but I feel like if you made it to this part of my video, we can talk pretty candidly. So I I'm on my second IUD, and I've had IUDs since I was like 19. I think I've had I've had 2 IUDs, I think, over the last 10 years, which is kind of horrifying to think in terms of like biologically, what is this like continued like hormone dosage really done for me whenever I do get them out permanently? But we'll cross that road when we get there. And like this, when I got my IUD, my second one, my body got obliterated, dude. It was so bad. Like, it was so bad. That whole, like, immediately after I got it, like, whatever my, like, hormonal responses to what happened was horrific and not a great time. However, I have not had to worry about having a kid in any way, shape, or form. Like, that has not had to have been a concern of mine for, like, 10 years. And the amount of, like, peace that gives you is crazy, bro. I can't even fathom, at this point in my life, I can't even fathom having to stress about potentially getting pregnant and like the worry that comes with that. I never had to have that problem. Never have not had that problem, dude. That is so scary. And so the idea of like that not being an accessible thing and that not being an option that's so anxiety inducing and crazy. And so I completely understand the freedom that she's talking about in this sense of like access to birth control, and not even just like, obviously mine is kind of like the more extreme version, but even just general access to birth control, to feel like your own woman and to not have to worry about potentially getting trapped in a bad situation or in a, bad relationship or whatever, however you want to phrase that. Oh my God, this is crazy. Chapter 19 opens with her talking to Joan about how Joan is going to move out of, or she's like getting out of the hospital, and she's moving in with Nurse Kennedy. Her roommates just got married and she needs someone to share the apartment. So she's not getting like properly discharged from the hospital, but still Esther is jealous about how she's like technically beating her through the gates, and she thinks it's BS. And again, it's just this like jealousy, rivalry thing with this like other version of herself, right? And then she gets her like, privileges to go and do stuff, and she ends up going out and meeting a guy at the library. He had asked for the time. She gave it to him. They asked to go to coffee. And I decided to practice my new normal personality on this man who, in the course of my hesitations, told me his name was Irwin and that he was a very well-paid professor of mathematics. And so I said, all right, and matching my stride to Irwin's, strolled down the long ice-encrusted flight at his side. It was only after seeing Irwin's study that I decided to seduce him. Irwin lived in a murky, comfortable basement apartment in one of the rundown streets of outer Cambridge and drove me there for a beer, he said. After 3 cups of bitter coffee in a student cafe, we sat in his study on stuffed brown leather chairs, surrounded by stacks of dusty, incomprehensible books, with huge formulas inset artistically on the page like poems. So they go on, they have a bit of conversation, and by the end of the evening, I had no doubts about Irwin whatsoever. Ever since I'd learned about the corruption of Buddy Willard, my virginity weighed like a millstone around my neck. It had been such an enormous importance to me for so long that my habit was to defend it at all costs. I had been defending it for 5 years, and I was sick of it. It was only as Irwin swung me into his arms back at the apartment and carried me wine-dazed and limp into the pitch-black bedroom that I murmured, "You know, Irwin, I think I ought to tell you I'm a virgin." Irwin laughed and flung me down on the bed, not believing her until, like, stuff actually happens, and then he believes her, and she ends up hemorrhaging, like, bleeding uncontrollably. She doesn't want to tell him this, though, and she also doesn't want him to take her to the asylum, because that would be her having to admit that she's not, who she says she is. And so she has him take her to Joan's house. She at least knows where Joan lives because she moved in with the nurse, right? And so he takes her there, drops her off. She bangs on the door. Joan comes out and finds her, finds out she's bleeding. It's this whole ordeal trying to get a doctor that late at night. And she didn't tell Joan what exactly was going on and what exactly happened. And so Joan is like telling these people that it's a period problem. And so all of them basically hang up on her or dismiss it. And eventually it gets to the point where she's going to have to drive her to the ER or to like one of the hospital wards or something and get treated there. She does. Everything's okay. Like they get it treated and her closed up and she's good to go. But it was still very, very scary for a little bit there. Again, an indeterminate amount of time passes, but she's healed up from that. She's fine. And she's back at the asylum sleeping. And she wakes up in the middle of the night from one of the doctors knocking on her door, saying, "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Greenwood, and especially at this time of night, but I thought you might be able to help us find Joan." For a moment, I wonder if Dr. Quinn was going to blame me for Joan's return to the asylum. I still wasn't sure how much Joan knew after our trip to the emergency ward, but a few days later, she had come back to live in Belsize, retaining, however, the freest of town privileges, right? So Joan was, at least at some point, discharged or semi-discharged to live with this nurse. Said, "Just kidding, you're back in the hospital," but still she was able to go out. And so that night she was supposed to go out to a movie, but she had never come back. A couple more hours pass by. Dr. Quinn, the doctor, comes back again, knocks on the door and says, "I thought you should know that Joan has been found. She's dead. She's hanged herself." Her other self, this embodiment of her version of who she used to be that was better than her, that she was jealous of this entire time for healing faster than her and doing better than her at everything, ended her life. And when we go into chapter 20, it's winter, and Esther is a week away from release as long as she can pass this interview with the various doctors to prove her healedness. Dr. Nolan had said quite bluntly that a lot of people would treat me gingerly or even avoid me like a leper with a warning bell. My mother's face floated to mind, a pale, reproachful moon, at her last and first visit to the asylum since my 20th birthday, which they had a falling out, and she it was a whole drama thing. I didn't talk about it because it doesn't really matter, but a daughter in an asylum, I had done that to her. Still, she had obviously decided to forgive me. "We'll pick up where we left off, Esther," she had said with her sweet martyr's smile. "We'll act as if all of this were a bad dream. To the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead baby, the world itself is the bad dream. A bad dream." I remembered everything. And then Buddy comes to visit her, right, at the asylum. But his car got stuck in a snowbank, and so they have to go out, and she helps him dig it out. And she does most of the work because obviously he's still recovering from TB stuff. He's recovered, but still you don't really want to push it. So she's taking care of that. And he says, "I've been wondering." "What have you been wondering?" "I've been wondering. I thought you might be able to tell me something." "I'll tell you if I can, Buddy. Do you think there's something in me that drives women crazy?" I couldn't help myself. I burst out laughing, maybe because of the seriousness of Buddy's face and the common meaning of the word crazy in a sentence like that. Buddy pushed on, "I dated Joan and then you, and first you went and then Joan. You had nothing to do with us, Buddy." "You're sure?" "Absolutely." Cut to a little bit of other time that passes. She's saying goodbye to people as she's moving on. So she's saying goodbye to some of the other patients at the wards. And she's thinking about how did I know that someday at college, in Europe, somewhere, anywhere, that the bell jar, with its stifling distortions, wouldn't descend again. And hadn't Buddy said, as if to revenge himself for my digging out the car and his having stand by, "I wonder who will marry you now, Esther." "What?" I'd said, shoveling snow up onto the mound and blinking against the stinging back shower of loose flakes. "I wonder who will marry you now, Esther, now that you've been..." In Buddy's gesture encompassed the hill, the pines, and the severe snow-gabled buildings breaking up the rolling landscape here. And of course I didn't know who would marry me now that I had been where I had been. I didn't know at all. Oh, man. And then she ends up calling the guy that she slept with and telling him about the emergency, hospital bill. It's a $20 bill for emergency attention, and she has to pay it by a certain date and then had a checkup. So she calls him to pay for it. He says, all right, I'm writing a blank check now." Irwin's voice altered subtly. "When am I going to see you?" "Do you really want to know?" "Very much." "Never," I said, and I hung up with a resolute click. I wondered briefly if Irwin would send his check to the hospital after that, and then I thought, of course he will. He's a mathematics professor. He won't want to leave any loose ends. And she's happy because, he doesn't know her name. He doesn't know where she lives. The only thing that he knows about her was Joan's house, but Joan's dead now, and the nurse that lived there moved away after Joan had died, and so there's nothing. She was perfectly free, and also having the birth control thing. She is perfectly free from this situation. She was able to get rid of this purity that hung over her head in this concern of it in a similar way to this whole bell jar thing where it was always kind of lurking in the back of her mind. It's gone now, and she's free and doesn't have to worry about this again, right? Joan's parents invited me to the funeral. She ended up going, and there would be a black 6-foot deep gap hacked in the hard ground. That shadow would marry this shadow, and the peculiar yellowish soil of our locality seal in the wound in the whiteness, and yet another snowfall erased the traces of newness in Joan's grave. I took a deep breath, and I listened to the old brag of my heart. I am. The book ends with Dr. Nolan about to walk into the room for the final interview with the doctors to get the approval to leave the asylum for good. And the ending with burying Joan and talking about the shadows and burying the shadows and her shadow self and then acknowledging that she's alive. She's officially kind of closing and almost in like a metaphorical sense, kind of like burying this past version of herself, this like depressed version of herself and all of these other things, and like moving on to like, bigger and better. And then, like I said in the very beginning with that first paragraph, or with one of the very, very early paragraphs in chapter 1, talking about having babies and her being that far in the future for whatever that means. Now, after we know what we know, right, after all of the concern about being married, the concern about having kids and getting on birth control and not knowing what she wanted out of the future, we don't know what happened to her next. We just know that she survived. I am. She lived, she got through all of this, and then had kids. And so then one of the biggest questions, I guess, that you would end this book on is, did she succumb to societal pressure and like living this life and just ended up in a situation like this? Or was it a choice? Like, did she eventually get maternal instincts? Did she fall in love with a guy? Did somebody change her mind about things and the idea of marriage? And is she living happily and still writing? The assumption would be, if this is an autobiographical account, the writing did in fact come back, right? The writing was there. She did live through it. Maybe the whole book was supposed to be an I made it thing, and it actually ended up being an account of life and what could be in a hopeful thing right before the bell jar descended again. Maybe it was a triggering thing to write that ended up bringing the bell jar back, along with a bunch of other tumultuous things. Sylvia Plath's life, especially obviously in the last couple of years when she was married to Ted Hughes and there was a whole bunch of things going on, was not very good. I am not a professional in any way. I have just read quite a bit about it, and I'm reading Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. It is a 1,100 page book about Sylvia's life and whatnot. I'm only 10% of the way through it, which is not very much for a book that large. But from that and just kind of general interest in things that I've read about her through the years, it was not very good. It was not a very good marriage. It was not a very good stretch of life, especially in that last little bit. And so who knows? The angle in which the book was written, the intent of it, what the hope of it was, if it was just getting it all out there, I don't know. And then I was looking through, because I'm always interested in books that I enjoy and identify with, because again, I'm a hater. If you've watched this, I usually talk crap about a lot of books. And so whenever I enjoy something, I try to go on Goodreads and look at 1-star reviews, or I go on Reddit and I look at some of the discourse about it. And so often when I do that, and I know it's probably a pretentious biased thing, I just feel like it's people not getting the point of the book. And it all comes down to the same thing of characters being unlikable and then people being like, oh, this person was horrible. I hated this book. This person was so annoying. And it's yeah, that's kind of the point, dude. People aren't likable. I'm sure if people wrote your life about genuinely the kind of person you are and what you do, nobody is likable. Everybody's kind of a shithead. The idea that the protagonist is inherently a good person in books is so misleading and completely ruins, I think, so many people's reading experiences. The genuine criticisms I saw were about the things I talked about the whole racist and homophobic and other things that were talked, and even homophobia personally I think is a stretch. I think there's some other stuff going on that needs to be accounted for when you talk about that. If you want to talk about the racist stuff, yeah, I totally understand that. If that is a reason to DNF the book or to not entertain the book, track and all, dude, I respect. But anything that's about the character herself, about Esther herself, it's wow, okay, so either you completely missed what the book was about, haven't experienced life in such a way, or you're not open to acknowledging people who have experienced life in such a way. A lot of comments were calling her whiny and all this other things. And I'm wow, dude, okay, so you are a part of the problem as well. You too are a problem. Esther, it irritates me so bad. Again, 60 years later, and it's still just the same arguments and stupid crap, and it's all just the same problems, and nothing gets better. like mental health and like the whole feminist thing and this whole purity thing, and it's all still there, and it's just sad and crappy. Things are a little bit better, but then it also feels like they're going backwards right now too, and so it's just like, I don't freaking know, dude. The world feels so on fire. I would like to believe though that this was like a hopeful book. I would like to believe that this was written, I don't even think it's hopeful. I think it's just a story. Not everything has to have a lesson. Not everything has to have a purpose. I know I say that. I like to read books with purposes. But in this case, I think if the purpose is just telling about your life, then that's what it is. The purpose is just talking about a 19-year-old that went through some really, really tough time in life and mental health crisis and how they got through it. That's enough of a story. It doesn't have to be any more than that. Like, what happens after the story is whatever. I don't know, man. It's a tough read. It's a very tough read. I think it's a very relatable read. Like I said, I think it's validating to know that people feel like that in the world, and that, at least me personally, I'm not alone in a lot of that stuff, because I have felt and had those same thought processes, at least to some degree, a lot in life. And so it felt good to not be alone. And it always feels good to be able to put words to things and explanations to things. Because sometimes it's just a feeling. Like sometimes you just carry this feeling and you don't know what it is until you read it somewhere. And you say, oh my God, that's exactly what it is. You finally put words to this like thing that's been hanging over me for so long. I finally have some type of explanation or way to explain it to other people. And that is such an incredible feeling to have words. I don't know. Like I said, there's resources in the description box below, and I believe in you. You got this. I'm thankful you're here. I'm incredibly grateful for you. And if you're going through a tough time, I hope it gets better soon. I hope you're able to find some peace and keep pressing on, and just know that the bell jar does get lifted. It can get lifted. And if it takes medication or other treatments, not electrotherapy or lobotomies, obviously, but talking to doctors and therapy and stuff, then I hope that you have the resources and that you're able to do that, because it does make a difference, and there's no shame in any of those things. I think we're finally moving to a point in our society and our world where those aren't shameful things to have. Like, I think people are pretty casual about talking about therapy and medication for mental health and whatnot. But just in case you need to hear it, if you need them, you need them. Even if you want them, if you think they might help you. There's no shame in any of that stuff. So, okay, that's all I have. I'm going to go stew over this book for another hour, think about my life. Again, I appreciate all of you guys. Thank you so much for everything. So eternally grateful. I will see you on Thursday with something. I haven't decided yet. I know the poll is favoring the Blood over Bright Haven or whatever book. Probably not going to do that one this week. I'll probably end up doing the Murderbot one, just because reading sucks. I don't want to read something really long right now. So I'll get through Blood, Bright Haven, whatever. I'll post that eventually. I have like a whole log of stuff in the backlog that I need to get through. So I'll probably do the Murderbot on Thursday, and then do like a poll roundup next week. And then you guys can revote for some of the stuff that's come up lately. And then that'll kind of shape off what I do over the next couple weeks. Okay, I think that's all I have, guys. Yeah. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.